Welcome back to the movie recap. Today's movie will be a 2021 Indian biographical historical drama film titled Sardar Udham. Sit back, relax and enjoy the video. The movie begins in 1931 in India with the release of Udham, the protagonist. As he's staying in a guest house, he finds out that all of his Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, HSRA, comrades are either in prison or dead. He plans to head for London but is cautioned that someone is tailing him. A week after, the man who was supposed to be tailing Udham finally reports to the Rawalpindi police station to inform them of his disappearance. However, the British government finds out soon after that Udham has applied for a new passport to England. It matches his description, but it's issued under a different name. In 1933, Udham arrived in Russia before ultimately reaching London by ship. Udham walks into a restaurant where he shows a piece of paper with the restaurant's name. The man he approaches shakes his head and informs him that whoever he's looking for may be in the Sikh temple instead. As he leaves, someone else catches up to him and takes him to a meeting of HSRA sympathizers based in London. They offer their help and ask about his plans. They advise him to change his name and lie low in the meantime. 6 years later, Udham enters Caxton Hall. O'Dwyer, a former lieutenant governor of Punjab, is giving his speech about his time in Punjab, and how he had prevented a significant uprising. He's greeted by thunderous applause from the audience as he finishes. Udham walks up to him, calls him by his name, and then shoots him repeatedly. He also turns his gun at the group sitting on the stage consisting of the Secretary of State for India and former governors of Punjab and Bombay. The police run towards Udham, and he's arrested immediately. The aftermath is massive, with the British government and many of its citizens angered by the public execution. The British government promises not to tolerate what it deems an act of terrorism or any movement against the British Empire. The London-based HSRA sympathizers worry that Udham would name them. But they also can't help but admire him for doing what he said he would do. Udham is beaten by the police as they demand that he give up his name and the organization he works for and explains why he did it. But he refuses to talk. So they raid his home, coming across multiple passports, notes, and newspaper clippings. They quickly connected the dot that he was the man they'd been waiting for, realizing that Udham had taken his time. Naturally, this breeds distrust against Indian men, and the police bring in dozens, believing they have some kind of connection with Udham. The police discover that Udham is an orphan and that his parents died when he was young. He grew up in an orphanage with his brother. They also find that he has entered London undetected several times since 1933 under different names. He took many odd jobs, most noticeably as a local stationery peddler. He was under the British police's watch 9 years after he left prison, but since he had been quiet, they had forgotten about him. During his interrogation, one of the policemen revealed that he didn't get all his targets, saying that he only fired 4 shots. He realizes that it means the Secretary of State for India, the last man he fired at, is still alive. They find a link between Udham and Eileen, an active British member of the Communist Party. They believe he successfully established links with other extremists through her. She's taken in, and she reveals that she knew him but knew next to nothing about him, especially not his plan. In a flashback, it's shown that Udham wanted help finding guns, which Eileen opposes, denying his assumption of her connection with the Irish Republican Army, IRA. He tries to get her sympathy by explaining that there's no freedom or liberty. Eileen argues that if he wanted freedom for India, he should be there instead of in London. He insists that what he's doing is the right way. Uncomfortable with the turn of their conversation, Eileen leaves. He still finds someone in the IRA and requests for arms to be shipped to Indian rebels. However, the shipment was discovered. It's believed there was a leak internally, and the surveillance against the IRA increased because of it. Finally, someone advises him to hide out in Russia. As he leaves for Russia, we discover that Eileen helped him with the IRA. The police switch their attention to his stay in Russia, where they believe he tried to look for another arms dealer, which was precisely what he did. He met with the Politburo to appeal for assistance against the imperialist British. They promise to do what they can but admit that they're readying for a different war, which is why it's not the best time. In another flashback, this time back in London, Udham approaches a man who gives him O'Dwyer's location and routine. Wanting to confirm the tip, he heads for the Kensington Gardens and tails the man. That evening, he finds O'Dwyer giving a passionate speech, justifying the decision to open fire at a peaceful gathering of over 20,000 people in Amritsar. Nevertheless, he remains steadfast in his belief that what they did that day was to stop a rebellion before it began. The next day, as O'Dwyer's left at home, Udham visits him under the guise of selling stationery, specifically an exquisite fountain pen. When O'Dwyer asks for the price, Udham tells him he's giving it to the man for free instead. This surprises O'Dwyer, but Udham explains that he used to work for O'Dwyer as a factory worker back in India. Instead of being grateful, O'Dwyer comments about how Indians aim to please. He insults the food and the weather but believes that he served the British Empire well during his time there. He complains about the educated and calls them communists because he thinks they instigated the rebellion. Offended, Udham argues that he's educated, which O'Dwyer denies since he seems rational. In present times, Detective Inspector Swain, the investigator on Udham's case, confronts him about his connection with the defunct HSRA. He threatens that he'll receive the same fate as Bhagat, an Indian revolutionist and Udham's idol. Udham is taken to another flashback where Bhagat is speaking to his group, stating that if asking for their rights is considered a rebellious act, they are indeed rebels. However, someone else corrects him to let him know they're no longer considered rebels but terrorists. Bhagat argues there's a distinct difference between the two. He asserts that their motive is not to create fear but to protest and inspire others to fight for their rights. In 1929, Bhagat was one of the men caught bombing the Central Assembly Hall in Delhi. Because of what happened, the ruling conservatives decided to prosecute the members of the HSRA. Hideouts were raided, members killed, and prominent ones arrested. Finally, in 1931, Bhagat was executed. Pressured by the higher-ups, Detective Inspector Swain appeals to Udham to admit his real name. He straightens his arm out and shows his real name tattooed on his left arm, Ram Muhammad Udham Azad. Realizing the religious implication of Udham's real name, someone suggests they control the press. However, Detective Inspector Swain reveals that many will still see his actions as an act of revolution. To prevent further constraint in India and London, the British government decides to forego any information about Udham's HSRA connection and paint him as a violent terrorist with no aim or purpose. The British police, led by Detective Inspector Swain, try to look for shreds of evidence to put Udham's name in a bad light so they can continue their claim that he's a criminal. Udham finally meets his lawyer, Hutchison. He greets Udham in India and informs the man that he was born in Kanpur. Udham mocks his law degree and points out that when a country punishes a person, the law is quoted, but if a government commits a crime against another, would it still be considered a crime under the law? Hutchison calls for Udham's cooperation if he wants the man to defend him. Hutchison asks Udham when he planned the assassination, and he remembers the time he approached O'Dwyer for a job. The man takes him on as a servant. One evening, O'Dwyer asks Udham where he was on the day of the Amritsar massacre and then remembers that Udham mentioned he was working in the factory on the railway. As Udham leaves, O'Dwyer announces that he believes those killed deserve it, accusing them of instigating a rebellion. The older man asks Udham if he is willing to kill a few for the safety of the majority, to which the younger man agrees. O'Dwyer tells him that means he agrees with him. The mutiny was inevitable during those days, so the fear they struck that day deterred what would have been a major disaster. That was the night Udham realized how evil O'Dwyer was. The man didn't feel any remorse for what they did. He left his job with O'Dwyer immediately, otherwise, he would have killed the man for a different reason which wouldn't be deemed a revolutionary act. When Prime Minister Chamberlain announced the war against Germany, Udham was frustrated, especially after he saw his boss giving a co-worker an earful. He orders his co-workers to stop working, calling their work slavery and saying they're being ruled by fear in London and back in India. He tells them they deserve to be treated like humans and equals. Their boss hears his speech and demands he explain himself. Fed up, he grabs the man by the lapels, threatening to kill him as he shakes the man around. His co-workers run to separate them. Tired of his reckless behavior, the London-based HSRA sympathizers beg him to stop. The world was at war. They tell him they'll resume once the war's over, but Udham believes it'll be too late. For him, it's the right time to act with the British government, too busy with the war. They disagree that it has to start in London when they're trying to force the British out of India. With the conversation going nowhere, they ask him to surrender any guns he may have and to leave. After seeing the flyer regarding the meeting of the East India Association and Royal Central Asian Society in Caxton Hall, Udham buys another gun. He is determined that O'Dwyer will die there. Back to the present, he tells Hutchison that he waited for 21 years to do what he did and asks if the murder will be considered a protest or a protest considered murder by British law. On the day of his trial, Udham argues with the prosecution and the judge. The judge asks him what he pleads, and Udham tells him he is not guilty. He denounces the British Empire, calling it a trading company that has become an imperialistic power that rules illegally and forcefully. The prosecution suggests they proceed with sentencing, which Hutchison opposes since the defense has not yet spoken. Instead, he demands a just trial. But the court is shown to be biased and charged Udham before the trial even started. The judge claims that they find Udham guilty and sentences him to hang to death. At the prison, Detective Inspector Swain visits Udham and offers an Indian dessert as a peace offering. Udham tells him that he has nothing more to say, but the other man reasons out that he knows Udham wasn't a killer and asks him what changed him. Udham finally discloses what happened on the day of the Amritsar massacre. Despite the peaceful protest, the Indian police under British rule turned violent. O'Dwyer ordered the arrest of Gandhi, as well as all college students. He also leaves instructions to isolate Punjab and destroy any publications until further notice. Finally, he calls for General Dyer's appointment. O'Dwyer calls and claims that Amritsar is in the hands of the rebels and calls for General Dyer to act accordingly. O'Dwyer suggests that punishment is not necessarily a deterrent and continues that if it is practical, it creates a fear of punishment. He calls for an example. On April 13, 1919, General Dyer authorized his men to open fire on a crowd of peaceful protesters made up of men, women, and children. Udham was supposed to be at that gathering with his girlfriend but was exceptionally late. A friend of his, who was mortally wounded, comes home, which wakes him up. He rushes out to the street and finds hundreds of bodies slowly dying, if not already dead. Everyone able desperately attempts to save who they can. Unfortunately, the city is cut off from the outside world, with too many bodies and insufficient supplies. Despite those in need of help, the military still enacts the curfew. Udham futilely attempts to save more wounded while hiding from the army. As he finishes his story, Detective Inspector Swain asks him if there's anything he can do for the man. Udham asks him to tell people that he is a revolutionary. Eileen visits Udham and pleads for him to ask for a pardon. He declines and tells her it's time for him to meet his friend. Udham is hanged, and a photo of Bhagat is held tightly in his fist. The movie ends with Dyer and O'Dwyer giving their accounts of the Amritsar massacre to the Hunter Commission. Both were indifferent about the thousands of lives lost that day and remained resolute that it was a necessary evil. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more videos like this to help the channel out. Have a nice day.